Imagine waking up one morning. Your wallet is still in your pocket. Your bank book is in the drawer. When you went to bed last night, you still had some savings. Perhaps you had worked for years, putting a little money aside whenever you could. But when you arrive at the bank that morning, you see hundreds of people gathered outside. People are shouting. Some are crying. Others are pounding on the doors. The bank employees are standing behind those doors. And before long, the news begins to spread. The bank has collapsed. Your money is gone. Your savings are gone. Yesterday, you may have been considered relatively wealthy. Today, you may have nothing left in your pocket except enough money to get back home. For millions of people, this was exactly what the Great Depression felt like. It was not simply a matter of numbers falling on the stock market. It was a massive collapse in which people lost their jobs, their homes, their farms, their savings, and perhaps most importantly, their confidence in the future. So how did the world reach this point? Did everything really happen in a single day? Or had the disaster been slowly approaching while everyone was busy enjoying themselves? Our story begins in the United States during the 1920s. The First World War had ended. In the years that followed, the United States was growing rapidly. Factories were operating, and new products were entering the market. Automobiles were becoming more common. Radios were appearing in people's homes, and household appliances such as vacuum cleaners and refrigerators were transforming everyday life. Cities were expanding, music, entertainment, and consumer culture were flourishing. These years were so lively that they became known to history as the Roaring Twenties. People believed the future was bright. In fact, the spirit of the era could be summarized in a single sentence. Becoming rich was no longer a privilege reserved only for the wealthy. At least that was what people believed. The stock market had become popular among ordinary Americans as well. Teachers, office workers, shopkeepers, and small investors had all begun buying shares. But there was one small yet extremely important problem. A large number of these people were not purchasing shares with their own money. They were borrowing it. For example, someone with $100 in their pocket could borrow additional money and purchase $1,000 worth of stock. If the stock price went up, they could make an incredible profit. But if the price went down, well, that part was not discussed very much. Because when the market is rising, nobody wants to think about the possibility that it might fall. The human mind has a strange habit. When something rises for a long time, we begin to believe that it will continue rising forever. House prices go up and we say they will never fall again. The stock market rises and we say this time is different. And when everyone begins doing the same thing, we forget that the crowd can also be wrong. That was exactly what happened in the United States at the end of the 1920s. Stock prices were rising much faster than the actual value of the companies behind them. A company's stock could rise even if the company was not producing very much. It could rise even if the company was not making enough profit. Because people were no longer thinking about what the company was worth at that moment. They were thinking about whether they could sell the shares for a higher price tomorrow. In other words, stocks had begun to turn from investments into a kind of gamble. But the stock market was not the only problem. Factories continued producing without stopping. Cars, household products, agricultural goods. But income distribution in society was deeply unequal. The wealthy were extremely wealthy. Yet the purchasing power of ordinary people was not growing as quickly as production. In other words, factories were producing more goods than people could afford to buy. Warehouses began to fill up. Sales began to slow. Companies started to struggle. But the stock market was still rising. It was as if a fire had started on the lower floors of a building, while the people upstairs simply turned up the music and continued dancing. Then October 1929 arrived. Investors began to realize that some companies were not as strong as they appeared to be. Some people sold their shares, then others began selling as well. As prices fell, panic grew. Instead of saying, "I will wait for a while, perhaps the market will recover," people tried to get rid of their shares as quickly as possible, because everyone had the same fear. What if it falls even further? October 24th, 1929 became known to history as Black Thursday. A massive wave of selling began on the stock market. Investors were almost racing against one another to sell their shares. But there were no buyers, because everyone wanted to sell. A few days later, on October 29th, Black Tuesday arrived. The market collapsed even more severely. Fortunes disappeared within a matter of hours. People who had borrowed money to invest did not simply lose the money they had put into the market. They were also left with debts they could never afford to repay. But there is an important point we need to understand here. The Great Depression did not happen simply because the stock market crashed. The market crash was the first major blow to an economic system that had already become dangerously fragile. The true disaster began when that blow reached the banking system. At the time, banks in the United States were not regulated as strictly as they are today. There was also no comprehensive government guarantee protecting the money people deposited in banks. Banks collected money from their customers and used it to provide loans and make investments. As the economy deteriorated, people became unable to repay their debts. Banks suffered losses. Whenever rumors spread that a bank was in trouble, people immediately rushed to its branches to withdraw their money. Think about it. A bank may hold money belonging to thousands of customers, but it does not keep all of that money inside its vault. Some of it has already been lent to other people. If everyone demands their money at the same time, the bank cannot possibly pay them all. This is known as a bank run. And during the early 1930s, thousands of banks collapsed. As banks failed, people's savings disappeared. A person might have worked and saved money for an entire lifetime, but if their bank collapsed, they could be left with absolutely nothing. This created an enormous sense of fear throughout society. People stopped trusting even financially stable banks. They withdrew their money and kept it inside their homes. Banks became unable to provide loans. Businesses that could not obtain credit were unable to invest. Factories reduced production. Companies began laying off their workers. People who lost their jobs could no longer afford to shop. As people stopped shopping, company sales fell even further. And as sales continued to fall, even more people were dismissed from their jobs. The economy entered a cycle that was extremely difficult to escape. Less spending, less production, more unemployment, and once again even less spending. This period cannot be understood through economic charts alone, because behind every number there was a real human being. A father would leave home in the morning to go to work, only to discover that the factory where he worked had locked its doors. A mother preparing food for her children would calculate how many more days the last bag of flour in the house could possibly last. Young people postponed marriage because they could not find work. Families were thrown out of their homes because they were unable to pay the rent. Some people traveled from city to city in search of employment. Whenever a factory announced that it was hiring, hundreds and sometimes thousands of people would line up outside. At the worst point of the crisis, the unemployment rate in the United States reached approximately 25%. That meant 1 out of every 4 people who wanted to work could not find a job, and social assistance programs were nowhere near as developed as they are today. There was no strong system capable of supporting someone for an extended period after they lost their job. Poverty spread rapidly. Long lines formed in major cities as people waited for free food. They would sometimes stand for hours, hoping to receive a bowl of soup and a little bread. People who had lost their homes built shelters from wood, scrap metal, and cardboard on empty pieces of land. These makeshift settlements became known as Hoovervilles. The name was a mocking criticism of Herbert Hoover, the American president at the time. Many people blamed the Hoover administration for the crisis. Even empty trouser pockets turned inside out were called Hoover flags. Newspapers used as blankets were called Hoover blankets. People were struggling with poverty, but they were also using dark humor to express their anger. Another tragic side of the Great Depression appeared in America's agricultural regions. For years, poor farming methods had been used in certain parts of the country. The soil had been overworked, and much of the natural vegetation had been destroyed. When a severe drought began during the 1930s, powerful winds lifted the fertile topsoil into the air. Enormous dust storms formed, covering the sky. This period became known as the Dust Bowl. Farmers lost both their crops and their land. Thousands of families were forced to leave the places where they had lived. They tied a few belongings to the backs of their cars and set off in search of a new life in other states. But there were no jobs waiting for them there either. The Great Depression quickly spread beyond the borders of the United States because the world's economies were connected. After the First World War, many European countries had become dependent on American loans. When American banks began demanding their money back because of the crisis, European economies were shaken as well. Countries began placing high taxes on imported goods in an attempt to protect their own producers, but other countries responded by doing exactly the same thing. As a result, global trade declined dramatically. While every country was attempting to protect its own economy, they were actually making the worldwide crisis even worse. The Great Depression had particularly devastating consequences in Germany. Germany was already struggling with serious economic and political problems following the First World War. As the crisis deepened, factories closed, banks collapsed, and millions of people became unemployed. Public confidence in the democratic system weakened. People began turning toward radical political movements that promised fast and absolute solutions. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party took advantage of this environment and increased their support. So the Great Depression was not merely an economic disaster. It was a historical turning point that transformed world politics and indirectly influenced the road leading to the Second World War. In 1932, a presidential election was held in the United States. Franklin Delano Roosevelt promised the American people a new order. When he became president in 1933, the country's banking system was almost completely paralyzed. As soon as Roosevelt entered office, he temporarily closed the banks. The government examined which banks were financially stable. The banks that were considered safe were allowed to reopen. The purpose of this decision was not simply to make a technical adjustment. The real goal was to restore public confidence. Roosevelt addressed the public through the radio. These broadcasts became known as fireside chats. The president tried to explain complicated economic issues in simple language. He explained how the banking system worked and encouraged people not to panic. Roosevelt's collection of economic programs became known as the New Deal. The government launched major public construction projects. Roads were built, bridges were constructed, dams were created, forests were restored and managed, public buildings, schools, and parks were built. Millions of people were provided with employment. New regulations were introduced for the banking system and the stock market. A deposit insurance system was created to protect people's bank accounts up to a certain amount. Social security programs were established to provide support for citizens during old age, unemployment, and other difficult circumstances. But there is one question that is still frequently debated. Did the New Deal completely end the Great Depression? Not exactly. Roosevelt's policies stimulated the economy, restored confidence in the banking system, and improved the lives of millions of people. But unemployment remained high for a long time. The American economy did not begin operating at full capacity until the Second World War. When the war began, the government started spending enormous amounts of money on aircraft, ships, weapons, vehicles, and other military equipment. Factories began operating again. Millions of people were employed in production. As millions of men joined the military, women entered factory work in far greater numbers. As a result, unemployment fell rapidly. In a painful twist of history, one of the largest wars humanity had ever witnessed played an important role in ending the greatest economic crisis of the modern era. So, what did the world learn from the Great Depression? First of all, people came to understand that an economy is not simply a collection of numbers. When a bank collapses, it is not only a company that disappears. People's dreams collapse with it. When a factory stops producing, it is not only the machines that fall silent. The dinner tables in thousands of homes become smaller as well. And when confidence disappears from an economy, people stop spending, stop investing, and stop making plans for the future. The Great Depression showed that governments could not remain completely passive in the face of economic crises. It became clear that banks needed to be regulated. It became clear that people's savings needed to be protected. And it became clear that leaving unemployed citizens entirely on their own could make an economic crisis even worse. The ideas of economist John Maynard Keynes also became increasingly influential during this period. According to Keynes, when individuals and businesses stopped spending, the government needed to intervene and spend money to stimulate the economy. Because sometimes an economy does not recover quickly on its own. Sometimes when the engine refuses to start, someone has to turn the key. Nearly a century has passed since the Great Depression. Today, banking systems are more strictly regulated. A significant portion of bank deposits is protected by government guarantees. Central banks provide money to financial markets during times of crisis. Governments offer unemployment benefits and social support programs. Behind all of these measures, we can still see the traces of the painful experiences of the 1930s. But perhaps the most important lesson of the Great Depression is this. No matter how powerful an economic system may appear, it is built on confidence. When people believe in the future, they invest, they start businesses, they buy homes, they have children, they make plans. But when confidence disappears, even the wealthiest country in the world can quickly find itself facing fear and poverty. At the end of the 1920s, people were celebrating, enjoying themselves, and watching the stock market rise higher and higher. They believed that a new era of prosperity had begun. Very few of them could have imagined that within a few years, banks would close, factories would fall silent, and millions of people would stand in line for a single bowl of soup. Perhaps this is exactly what history is trying to tell us. Great disasters rarely appear without warning. First, small cracks begin to form. People ignore those cracks. The music continues playing. The lights remain on. Everyone keeps dancing until the ground disappears beneath their feet. The Great Depression is not simply an economic crisis that happened in the past. It is also a powerful warning about how greed, uncontrolled borrowing, inequality, and social panic can push an entire system toward collapse. And perhaps the most frightening part of this story is this. The people living at that time also believed that they were modern, advanced, and safe. Just as we believe today.